Hello. Today we are going to discuss Dr. Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick's paper titled Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading. The basic idea behind this is to criticize a certain mainstream practice of literary criticism that has gained a lot of traction throughout the decades and is still going strong to this day. And Dr. Sedgwick is finding some problems with it and proposing another way of practicing literary criticism other than the one that is currently dominating literary academia. But before we dive into it, let's take a look at the scholar herself. Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick was born in 1950, and she was a poet, artist, literary critic, and teacher. She is best known for her work in the field of literary criticism, especially as one of the pioneering scholars of queer theory. Although the theory we're discussing in this video does not focus on queer theory, she did argue for an application of this particular theory's principles to a holistic and affirmative study of queer spaces, such as drag culture. You can check out the full article for detailed suggestions in her own words. Some of her most well-known works include Between Men, English Literature and Male Homosocial Desire, Epistemology of the Closet, and Touching Feeling. The essay we're reading today is actually a chapter from this last book. Sadly, Dr. Sedgwick passed away from breast cancer in 2009 at the age of 58. Although she is no longer with us, we can still appreciate the legacy of love, understanding, and hope she left within the sphere of academia, a space she helped to make more inclusive and diverse. To briefly go over the contents of this video, today we are going to discuss paranoia as a methodology, some of the characteristics of paranoid reading, the problems with paranoid reading, and reparative reading, which Dr. Sedgwick proposed as the alternative to paranoid reading. And then we'll wrap everything up with some discussion questions that you might consider. So first of all, what is paranoia in the context of literary criticism? Paranoid reading is a method of cultural criticism and interpretation that prioritizes the anticipation, recognition, and exposure of systemic oppressions above all else. This attitude has become the predominant mode of criticism in a lot of theories, including psychoanalysis, deconstruction, Marxism, New Historicism, feminism, queer theory, you name it. It's our go-to method of criticism that has become, quote, nearly synonymous with criticism itself. And Dr. Sedgwick proposed that this might be a problem because scholarship has become biased towards only one mode of interpretation and treating it like it's the only way of discovering the truth, and has become dismissive of every other theory that doesn't take, quote, a paranoid critical stance as naive, pious, or complacent. So what exactly are the limitations of these biases? Second, characteristics of paranoid reading include paranoia as anticipatory, reflexive, mimetic, has a strong theory, a theory focused on negative affects, and a theory that is reliant on exposure. We'll go through all of these one by one in more detail. First of all, paranoia is anticipatory. In simple terms, you can paraphrase this into one can never be paranoid enough. It is to engage in unresting vigilance against ideology lurking behind every corner, ready to pounce the oblivious reader. Second, paranoia is reflexive and mimetic, meaning that in order to catch on to any hidden message in the text so early on in the game, it takes one to know one. Anything you can do to me, I can do worse, and anything you can do to me, I can do first to myself. For example, if we want to guard ourselves against sexist messaging in a novel, we have to know how a sexist novelist would think and write, and for a brief moment, we are forced to think like a sexist in order to recognize any obscured signs of sexism that we are in danger of missing and in danger of simply taking in and accepting passively without even knowing that we are being indoctrinated. Third, paranoia is seen as a strong theory, meaning that this is a type of affect theory that is currently all-encompassing and seen as all-explaining. with an explanatory power that is able to account for a wide spectrum of phenomena which appear to be very remote to one another. So this would be the opposite of weak theory. And yes, that's actually a term that scholars use, strong theory, weak theory. And in the case of weak theory, it's only applicable to a very narrow set of texts or a very narrow set of phenomena. So if you have theory A and theory A only explains, for instance, the meaning of the novel The Great Gatsby, then that's a weak theory. You can't, it's very specific to a certain text or to a certain author. You can't apply it to anyone else or any other novel. Also, paranoia is a theory of negative affects, meaning that its main goal is to minimize negative affect rather than to maximize positive affect. In other words, you're not engaging with this theory to feel good about yourself as a reader or feel good about the text or its author. You're doing this to stave off some of the very worst effects a text might have on its reader, namely indoctrinating them without their knowing. So it's not exactly a cheerful project. Lastly, paranoia is a strategy that is reliant on exposure, meaning that its main goal is to expose a subject by revealing its underlying ideological trappings and to narrate the process and findings of that uncovering to the audience in order to get its story truly known to them. You might recognize this strategy at work in a scholarly source by signal words, like popular signal words, I might say, like reveal, uncover, denaturalize, or demystify. So, what could be some of the problems with paranoid reading if it's overrepresented in literary academia? First of all, Sedgwick notes that it stops with the representation of knowledge and does not progress toward an active utilization of said knowledge. More specifically, it doesn't seek to transform existing power structures, only to understand it and describe it. By doing so, paranoia's potential as a medium of political or cultural struggle is severely limited. In other words, the exposure and the narration of violence alone is not enough to motivate change or action in the audience. While this could be said about any mode of literary criticism, Sedgwick is criticizing the way that paranoid reading is academically privileged because it is somehow presumed to be more politically engaging and instigating than any other type of reading, when that is not necessarily true. Second, it can be reductive, dismissive, and paranoid of alternative tools for thinking that aren't immediately paranoid and defensive. But since to be paranoid means to be reflexive and mimetic of what we fear in order to critique it, there is only an imitation of the very mode of discourse that we hold suspect, rather than the creation of a new mode of discourse altogether, or a meaningful usage of alternative concepts or ideas. In Sedgwick's view of literary paranoia, it is more dangerous for such reification ever to be unanticipated than often to be challenged. The third problem with paranoid reading is that as an affect theory of humiliation or fearing humiliation, it has a weak performative function. So according to another critic, Dr. Tompkin, a humiliation theory is strong to the extent to which it enables more and more experiences to be accounted for as instances of humiliating experiences on the one hand, or to the extent to which it enables more and more anticipation of such contingencies before they actually happen. The strong here referring to humiliation theory being a strong theory. Now, as this account suggests, far from becoming stronger through obviating or alleviating humiliation, a humiliation theory becomes stronger exactly insofar as it fails to do so. In other words, its explanatory power comes at the cost of the power to fix, heal, or ease the pain of systemic or ideological violence. Like we mentioned before, the main function of this theory is to describe how the pain of systemic or ideological violence can be experienced or how it can come about, rather than focusing on how that pain can be fixed or eased through systemic intervention or other types of solutions. I don't know about you, but personally, I strongly agree with these last 2 points in particular, being overly reliant on describing power structures and also being quite circular. Although I'm no professor, as a graduate student, I realized that I've actually felt this way for quite a while now. Ever since my last years in college, I felt that I was doing the same thing over and over again with almost every analysis of a text, which was to arm myself against any type of ideology that might be in the text, dissect traces of that ideology in the text, and make a critique about how problematic that text was. Now that I think about it, I wasn't bored or frustrated just because it was becoming repetitive. I felt that way because it wasn't showing me anything really new about the text. I was mainly confirming my suspicions about the text, about the writer, about the society that produced them. Sometimes that whole process felt like I was discussing my political beliefs and proving my intellectual armor against other political beliefs by utilizing a text rather than appreciating the text itself for what it was, a piece of literature. Now, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing or a useless thing. In the end, every piece of critique is about the author's own beliefs. But sometimes, after weeks and weeks of going through a different text, it felt like I was fundamentally doing the exact same thing with every one of them, which is why I really appreciate how Sedgwick calls for more engagement with frameworks that have fallen out of fashion, like new criticism, for instance. Perhaps this is just because I was educated in a Korean university where the curriculum is strongly influenced by American curricula, but perhaps it really is time for us to diversify our methods of reading. That is to say, with all its shortcomings, there is absolutely no reason why paranoid reading should reign supreme at the cost of other methodologies. One alternative of literary studies that Sedgwick offers is reparative reading. Now, in order to understand reparative reading, we must first discuss the concept of the depressive position proposed by Dr. Melanie Klein. As opposed to the paranoid position, the depressive position is an anxiety mitigating achievement, which makes it possible for someone to turn to use one's own resources to assemble or repair the hating, envying, murderous part objects that we encounter in our everyday life or while reading a text. We can turn these aggressive forces that we encounter into something like a whole, something more wholesome. Once assembled to one's own specifications, the more satisfying object is available both to be identified with and to offer one nourishment and comfort in turn. Reparative reading can be achieved through processes like love and hope, processes that leave one open and vulnerable to surprises of all kinds, the unpleasant ambush of a controversy, insidious propaganda, but also things like passion, humor, disruption, rare juxtapositions of different cultures and communities inside a text. All these things that are more often than not brushed aside as distractions or ornaments when it comes to paranoid accounts of texts. And even though we've already gone through the most important parts of Dr. Sedgwick's argument, I still want to share this one particular paragraph from the essay word for word. It's a passage that I like to consider as Dr. Sedgwick's polemic against paranoia's dismissal of reparative reading. Reparative motives are inadmissible in paranoid theory both because they're about pleasure or because it's merely aesthetic, and because they're frankly ameliorative or merely reformist. But what makes pleasure and amelioration so mere? Only the exclusiveness of paranoia's faith in demystifying exposure. only its cruel and contemptuous assumption that the one thing lacking for global revolution, explosion of gender roles, or whatever, is peoples, that is, other peoples, having the painful effects of their oppression, poverty, or deludedness sufficiently exacerbated to make the pain conscious, as if otherwise it wouldn't have been, and intolerable, as if intolerable situations were famous for generating excellent solutions. Now, although the language is quite strong here, I do agree with the general, the main message of this passage. I know that scholars aren't, you know, we are not trying to be purposefully cruel and contemptuous when we're warning other people against certain propaganda that might be in a text, or drawing attention or raising questions about certain ideological tendencies in a piece of text. But from my own experience, I have found that paranoid reading doesn't just make me paranoid about the text, it makes me paranoid about myself. Celebrating or uplifting a work of literature makes me feel anxious because it makes me feel like I'm inadequate. I'm paranoid that I might be missing something, that I might be blind or even complicit with problematic or controversial aspects of a work that I'm not fully addressing. I feel like for every compliment that I pay to a work of literature, I have to come up with some negative criticism to balance it out, or otherwise I'm being naive and kind of being unquestioningly celebratory about a certain author. And I think we as scholars of text, instead of just consumers or readers, we're strongly discouraged from idolizing certain authors, no matter how much we might like them. And while everyone needs a good measure of self-reflection and self-criticism to be a good scholar, I feel like we're also allowed to make more room for appreciation and enjoyment, whether championing a text's aesthetics, politics, or historical significance. We should be allowed to analyze its beauty as much as we are encouraged to analyze its politics, particularly when the playing field has tilted so much in favor of only one. So, what do you guys think? Here are some discussion questions that you might want to ask yourself or your peers who are also interested in English literature and literary criticism. First, what are your thoughts or experiences regarding paranoid or reparative readings? Do you think one is still dominant over the other? Are you satisfied with the current practices of literary criticism? Why or why not? Second, what do you think of Sedgwick's two-part model of literary criticism? Do you see the binary as simplistic and limiting, or accurate and convenient? Can you think of other types of readings that fall into neither or both categories? Thank you for your attention. These are the sources that I used for this video. If you want to learn more about Dr. Sedgwick and her work for yourself, here are the links and the sources that you can use.